The first thing I noticed was the duffel bag. It was sitting on June Matsuda's porch at 5 in the morning, right next to her coffee cup. She was standing behind it with her arms crossed, watching me load the truck like she'd been waiting. 14 months that woman had lived on the other side of my duplex wall. I could count our real conversations on one hand, a wave when I backed out of the driveway, a nod when we checked our mailboxes at the same time. That was the whole relationship. Then she walked to the end of my driveway and said, "You forgot a blanket. It drops below freezing at Slough Creek in September." I hadn't told her where I was camping. I hadn't told her I was leaving. She leaned in through my open window and whispered, "I already packed." The bag on her porch was already zipped shut. My name is Ethan Calloway. I'm 34 years old. I coordinate delivery routes for a regional distributor, which is a way of saying I spend my days arguing with truck drivers about highway closures and staring at maps until my eyes blur. Once in a while, someone calls me at 2 in the morning because a shipment of frozen shrimp is melting on a loading dock in Billings. That's the peak excitement. I moved into the duplex 18 months before that morning with June's bag on her porch. 3 weeks after my divorce went through. Claire and I had been married for 4 years. I thought we were fine. Not great. Fine. We ate dinner at the same table, watched the same shows, visited her parents for holidays, and mine for birthdays. Ordinary things. The night she told me she wanted out, she sat on the edge of our bed and said, "You're never really there, Ethan." I was sitting right next to her. I remember staring at the carpet and thinking that was a strange thing to say to someone who was right there. I asked what she meant. She said she didn't know how to explain it, that I was present and reliable and kind, and none of that was the same as being there. She said it like she'd practiced the words and still didn't know if they were the right ones. I didn't fight the divorce, not because I didn't care, because I couldn't prove she was wrong. I found the duplex the following week. Ground floor, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that smelled like the previous tenant's cat. The landlord walked me through and pointed at the shared wall. Other side is a young woman, quiet type, veterinary tech. He said it like he was listing amenities. Free parking, coin laundry, quiet neighbor. I signed the lease because the rent was reasonable and the commute was short. I didn't think about the wall. I moved in on a Saturday with everything I owned in the back of my truck. Had the whole place unpacked by Sunday afternoon. The quiet that first night was so complete I could hear the neighbor's faucet running through the wall. I told myself that was peaceful. Then I started hearing things. Nothing alarming, just routine things. Her alarm went off at 6:15 every morning. A piano melody that came through the drywall like a song playing in the next apartment. She ran the faucet twice every evening, once around 7, once around 10. She talked to someone on the phone Tuesday nights. I couldn't hear the words, just the shape of her voice. It went up and down in a rhythm that sounded like she was telling a story and waiting for someone to laugh. She sneezed exactly 3 times in a row every single time, like her body had a policy about it. That's how I learned who June Matsuda was. Not through conversation, through a wall. She'd moved in 2 months after me. I was hauling a trash bag to the cans when a small U-Haul backed into the driveway, and a woman in paint-stained jeans started unloading boxes alone. I offered to help. She said, "I'm fine, but if you wanted to hold the door, that would save me about 30 trips." So I held the door. She thanked me with a nod and went back to her boxes. That was the first conversation. The second came a month later. I found a yellow sticky note on my front door. "Your porch light was on all night. Thought you should know." There was no name on it, no signature, just the message in small, careful handwriting. I knew it was June because nobody else shared a porch with me. I threw it in the trash. Then I fished it out 5 minutes later and put it in my kitchen drawer. I don't know why. A week after that, another one. Package was sitting in the rain. Moved it inside your gate. Then a third on a Sunday morning. "Your tomato plant needs water, badly." I didn't even know I had a tomato plant. Turns out the previous tenant had left one on the back stoop and it was still alive out of spite. I watered it. It died within the week. But I kept the note. I kept all of them. They piled up in my kitchen drawer like a quiet record, someone attention to my life in ways I hadn't asked for and didn't know what to do with. There were 7 by the time September came around. 7 notes. 1 wave and 1 nod per week. 0 real conversations since the day she moved in. That was my relationship with June Matsuda. Sticky notes and sounds through drywall. The camping trip was Marco's idea. Marco Reyes, 36, same company, different department. He ran the warehouse, I ran the routes. We'd been planning this trip for 3 months. Slough Creek, deep in Yellowstone's backcountry. 5 days, no cell service, nothing but elk and cold water, and the kind of silence that makes you forget spreadsheets exist. Marco was the one person at work who didn't treat my divorce like a spectator sport. When everyone else asked how I was doing in that careful voice people save for funerals and bad test results, Marco just said, "Let's go camping." That was his whole pitch. I said yes. We split the gear list. We planned the route. He bought a new sleeping bag and sent me a picture of it, like he'd adopted a child. Then, 2 nights before we were supposed to leave, my phone buzzed at 11. "Can't make it. Vanessa says she needs me home this weekend." Long story. Sorry, man. Vanessa was Marco's girlfriend, 8 months together. She lived in Denver, 4 hours away, and the distance had turned their relationship into a series of negotiations where Marco always lost. She didn't like him making plans without her. She didn't like him disappearing for 5 days where she couldn't reach him. She'd given him a choice, and Marco chose the way Marco always chose. I typed 3 different replies. Deleted all of them. Sent "no worries, next time." There wasn't going to be a next time. I knew that. Marco probably knew it too, but that's what you say. I almost canceled the whole trip. Slough Creek is a 10-hour drive. Going alone meant hauling everything yourself, cooking on a single burner, sitting by a fire with nobody to talk to. But I'd already taken the days off. The truck was half packed. And somewhere in the back of my head, Claire's voice was still telling me I was never really there. A week alone in the mountains seemed like a decent place to figure out what that meant. So I set my alarm for 4:30 on a Friday morning and started loading the truck in the dark. That's when I saw the duffel bag. I've already told you about the bag. What I haven't told you is what happened after she whispered it. I stared at her. That's the honest answer. I stood there with a sleeping bag under one arm and just stared. She was wearing a flannel shirt over a t-shirt, hiking boots that looked broken in, and an expression that dared me to say no. "You want to come camping?" I said it flat like a fact. "You have an empty passenger seat and a 10-hour drive. I have 5 days off and gear that fits in one bag." We've barely talked. 5 times, she said. "You're not counting the recycling fire." That had happened 3 months earlier. A neighbor's kid had dropped a sparkler into my recycling bin on the 4th of July. June knocked on my door at 10 at night, said your recycling is on fire, with complete calm, and walked back inside. By the time I got out there with a bucket, she'd already handled it with her garden hose. We never spoke about it again. "June, why?" She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at the truck, at the gear piled in the bed, at the empty seat. "Marco bailed. I heard him cancel through the wall." "That wall again. 14 months of it." "You heard that. The walls are thin, Ethan. You know that." I did know that. I just hadn't thought about what it meant from her side. She picked up her duffel bag and held it against her hip. "I'm not trying to make this weird. I just think it's a waste for one person to sit in a truck alone for 10 hours when there's someone right next door who already took the time off." I should have said no. You don't drive to Yellowstone with a neighbor you've spoken to 5 times. That's how true crime podcasts start. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the sticky notes. Maybe it was the fact that she knew about Slough Creek without being told. Maybe it was the way she stood there without shrinking the ask, without apologizing for it. "You have a sleeping bag?" I asked. "Rated to 15 degrees. Bear spray." "Bought it in June. 3 months ago." She'd bought bear spray 3 months ago. I figured she was the kind of person who plans ahead. "Get in the truck," I said. She didn't smile. She picked up her coffee cup, walked across the strip of grass between our porches, and climbed into the passenger seat like she'd done it before. Her duffel went behind the seat. She pulled the seatbelt across and clicked it without looking at me. "Your mirrors need adjusting," she said. I adjusted the mirrors. We pulled out of the driveway at 5:20. The neighborhood was still dark. The only sound was the tires on gravel and the heater ticking on. For the first 40 minutes, neither of us said a word. I don't mean the small talk was thin. I mean silence. The kind that fills a truck cab and sits between 2 people like a third passenger. She rode with 1 foot tucked under her, watching out the window. Fields and highway guardrails, and the slow bleed of sunrise coming in from the east. I kept glancing over. Quick looks, the kind you hope the other person doesn't notice, she noticed. I could tell because the corner of her mouth moved every time I did it, this tiny twitch that wasn't quite a smile. She had her hands wrapped around the thermos, both thumbs hooked through the handle, relaxed, like she rode in trucks at dawn with near strangers on a regular basis. The truck cab smelled like camp fuel and something with mint in it, her shampoo, I think. It mixed with the coffee she drank slowly from a thermos with a dent in the lid. Around mile 30, she reached forward and turned off the radio. I hadn't even realized it was on. Just static from a station we'd driven out of range of 20 miles back. "Thank you," I said. "It was bothering you." "How could you tell?" "Your jaw was doing the thing." "I didn't know my jaw did a thing." "What thing?" "You clench it a little when something irritates you. You do it when your truck doesn't start on the first turn. You do it when the mail comes late." I looked at her. She was watching the road, not me. "You notice a lot," I said. "The walls are thin," she said again. Like that explained everything. 14 months of shared wall. She knew my alarm went off before 5. She knew I watched something on my laptop Thursday nights because she could hear me laugh at the same time each week. She knew what my jaw sounded like when I was annoyed. And I knew her sneeze came in threes. Her phone calls were on Tuesdays. Her alarm was a piano melody. We'd been learning each other for over a year without meaning to. I didn't think of it as anything more than proximity. You hear things when you share a wall. Around mile 50, she shifted in her seat. "Ground rules." "For what?" "For spending 5 days in the woods with someone you barely know." "Go ahead. Silence is fine. Don't feel like you have to fill it." I wasn't going to. "Good. I set up my own tent and carry my own gear. You don't need to do anything for me." "You brought a tent in that bag?" "Tent, sleeping bag, 5 days of clothes." I glanced at the duffel behind her seat. It was barely bigger than a grocery bag. "That's not packing light. That's a magic trick." The corner of her mouth moved again. Closer to a smile this time, still not there. "One more thing," she said. "When we get back, this doesn't have to be anything. No obligations, no weirdness. We go back to the notes on the door and the waves from the driveway." "Fine. Fine." She said all of it like someone reading terms off a lease agreement. Clear conditions, no room for misunderstanding. I respected that. Rules were my whole job. She turned back to the window. I turned back to the road. The sun climbed. The highway stretched flat ahead of us, and the fields on both sides opened up gold and empty. June reached into her bag and pulled out a small tube of sunscreen. She squeezed some onto her palms, rubbed it across her forearms, and put the tube back without offering me any. September sun. She'd thought about September sun. I drove. She sat. The miles went by and the silence between us shifted into something that wasn't awkward anymore, but it wasn't comfortable either. Something I didn't have a word for. Somewhere past mile 80, she looked over at me. "You need gas," she said. I checked the gauge. She was right, a quarter tank left. I pulled off at the next exit and parked beside a pump. Before I'd even cut the engine, June was already unbuckling her seatbelt and reaching for the door handle. She moved like she had a plan. I was starting to think she always did. She was inside the gas station before I'd finished swiping my card at the pump. I topped off the tank, cleaned the windshield with one of those squeegees that only rearranges the dirt, and leaned against the fender waiting. September morning sun, already warm for the hour. The highway shimmered about a quarter mile out. A semi blew past and rocked the truck on its springs, and I watched it disappear toward the horizon. June came back carrying 2 paper cups in a plastic bag. She handed me one of the cups, black, 1 sugar. I looked at it, then at her. "How do you know that?" "You make coffee every morning at 4:52. I can hear the grinder through the wall." She pulled the tab on her own lid and blew across the surface. "You stir once. People who use cream stir more than once." I drank. It was right, black, 1 sugar. She reached into the plastic bag and pulled out a tube of sunscreen, set it on the hood of the truck in front of me, like she was placing a piece of evidence on a courtroom table. "I have sunscreen," I said. "No, you don't. You told Marco 3 weeks ago you'd grab some before the trip." I heard the conversation through the wall. She took another sip of her coffee. "And I heard you not buying it every day after." 3 weeks. She'd been keeping a running inventory of things I said I'd do and hadn't done, filed away on the other side of the drywall like a quiet parallel ledger that I never knew existed. "It's practical," she said. "You're pale and you burn fast. I've seen you watering the back plants without a shirt on, and I'm telling you, that's a public health situation." I put the sunscreen in my door pocket and got back in the truck. She climbed in after me. We pulled onto the highway and she reached into her bag again. This time she took out a folded piece of paper. She hadn't pulled out her phone or a Maps app. It was an actual piece of lined paper torn from a yellow legal pad, covered in small, careful handwriting. The same handwriting from the sticky notes on my door. She unfolded it on her knee and smoothed the creases with her palm. "What is that?" I asked. "Stops." "What kind of stops?" "Places between here and Yellowstone that are worth pulling over for." My list was long. Each entry had a name, a brief description, and a mile marker or exit number. Some had small stars drawn next to them. A few had notes in the margins. I could see one that said, "Bring jacket, exposed ridge," and another that said, "Cell service for about 10 minutes here." She read a few out loud. "Hot Springs off Route 20. Closed to the public, but the trailhead parking lot overlooks the runoff pools and nobody checks. Bakery outside Casper. Only open Saturdays. We'll hit it on the way back if we time it right. Overlook at mile marker 112. Best at sunset, but morning light works too." I counted at least 15 entries, all handwritten and carefully organized by mile marker instead of by interest. She'd built this like a route plan. I know route plans. I build them for a living. "When did you make this?" I asked. She folded the paper back along its creases and set it on her knee. "April. 5 months." She'd started compiling a list of stops on a road nobody had invited her to travel. 5 months of quiet research for a trip she had no reason to believe she'd ever take. The bear spray she'd bought in June made a different kind of sense now. I wanted to ask why, but I knew whatever she said would sound practical. Something about thin walls and overheard Yellowstone conversations. Something that would make perfect sense on the surface and sit differently underneath. So I kept my eyes forward and let it go. The music argument started around mile 140. She reached for the dial without asking. Spun through static, a preacher selling salvation at a volume that could strip paint, more static, and landed on classic rock. Guitars and a singer who sounded like he was trying to fight his way out of the speakers. "No," I said. "No what?" "I can't do Led Zeppelin for the next 6 hours." "What's wrong with Led Zeppelin?" "Nothing is wrong with Led Zeppelin. I just need something that doesn't make me feel like I'm in a truck commercial." "This is a truck." "Exactly my point." She turned the dial to a country station and I shook my head. She kept scanning through a pop song with too much bass, made a face at that too, and finally found something acoustic, a woman singing about a freight train and a river. Folk, maybe. The kind of song that sounds like it was recorded in somebody's kitchen, with one microphone and a dog sleeping in the hallway. "This?" she asked. "This works." "You're picky for someone who was driving on pure static for half an hour." I wasn't listening to it, I just hadn't noticed. "That tracks," she said. The station faded 20 minutes later and she found another one, then another. She had a system. She'd listen for about 15 seconds, tilt her head like she was tasting something, and either leave it or keep scanning. After the fourth switch, I realized she was building a soundtrack in real time. "You could just plug your phone in," I said. "Aux cable is in the glove box." "I don't have a playlist for this." "For what?" "For driving across Wyoming with someone I barely know. There's no Spotify category for that." She settled on jazz and neither of us complained. We let it fill the cab. We hit a second gas stop around hour 3. I went inside this time. She pumped. When I came back carrying 2 bags of trail mix and a package of beef jerky, she was leaning against the truck with her arms crossed, squinting at me. "Trail mix," she said. "You don't like trail mix?" "I like trail mix. I don't like raisins." "They all have raisins, June. The one with the blue label doesn't." I looked at the bags in my hands, both green labels. She took one from me and got back in. Over the next 30 miles, she picked the raisins out one at a time, placing each one on a napkin balanced on her knee. A small, organized pile, every raisin removed with 2 fingers and set down with the focus of someone defusing a bomb. "You could have said something before I went inside," I said. "You were already in line, and this is more satisfying." I came close to laughing, close enough that she noticed. The corner of her mouth lifted for half a second, the closest she'd come to a real smile all morning. My phone buzzed in the cup holder around 2 in the afternoon. Marco's name. I picked up on speaker without thinking, then realized June was sitting right there. She raised her eyebrows but stayed quiet. "Hey man." Marco's voice filled the cab, big and easy the way he sounds when he's feeling good about a decision. "How's the road?" "Long, flat." "Sounds about right. You driving solo?" Half a second of hesitation, maybe less. "Yeah." June looked out the window, no reaction, just turned her head and watched the guardrail go by. "Listen," Marco said, "I know I bailed on you and I feel bad about that, but Vanessa and I talked for 3 hours last night. 3 hours, Ethan. She opened up about everything. She said she's been feeling disconnected and she just needed to know I'd choose her over the trips and the buddies and the plans. So I did. I chose her. That's good, Marco. She's happy. I can hear it in her voice. First time in months she sounds like herself. He paused. This was the right call. I'm glad it worked out. All right, drive safe. Send me pictures of the creek. Will do. I hung up. The cab went quiet. June was still looking out the window. Her thumb traced a slow circle on the rim of her cup. You didn't tell him I was here, she said. No. Why? I don't know. That was the honest answer. I didn't know why I'd lied to Marco. Maybe because explaining June would mean explaining things I hadn't figured out yet. Maybe because hearing him talk about choosing Vanessa made me feel something I couldn't name, and adding the woman in my passenger seat to that conversation would have made the feeling louder than I was ready for. If you've been enjoying this story, consider subscribing. There are more like it on the channel. June didn't push it. She picked up the list from her knee and tapped the next entry with her finger. About an hour later, she pointed at a turnoff I would have driven straight past. No sign, no guardrail, just gravel curving up the side of a low ridge with nothing marking it as a destination. Mile marker 112, she said. The overlook. I turned. Gravel popped under the tires as we climbed. A quarter mile up, the road opened onto a flat shelf of rock that looked out over a valley I hadn't known existed. Green and gold and wide, with a river cutting through the center that caught the afternoon light and threw it back. The view didn't need sunset to justify itself. It was the kind of place that makes you forget where you were headed and why you were in a hurry to get there. I parked and we both got out. June walked to the edge and stood with her hands in her jacket pockets. The wind pushed hair across her face and she didn't fix it. I stayed a few feet behind her. The valley spread out below us. Neither of us spoke. Just the wind and the grass bending on the slope and the truck engine ticking as it cooled. I need to tell you something, she said. Something in her voice changed. The easy rhythm from the truck was gone. She was choosing her words now, one at a time, and I could hear the difference. Okay. She didn't turn around. That first month you lived in the duplex, after your divorce. She paused. I could hear you through the wall. I knew what she was about to say before she finished. I heard you crying, Ethan. The wind kept blowing. The valley stayed right where it was. Nothing in the world moved except something behind my ribs that tightened fast, like a fist closing around a thing I'd thought was buried. It was late, 2, 3 in the morning, and it wasn't once, it went on for weeks. I stood very still. I thought about knocking, she said, every time. But we'd only spoken once, the day I moved in and you held the door. I remember. So I didn't knock, I left notes instead. 7 sticky notes in my kitchen drawer. Your porch light was on. Package moved inside your gate. Your tomato plant needs water. Her way of reaching through the wall without breaking it down. I stood there trying to figure out what you're supposed to feel when someone tells you they heard the worst version of you. The nights I'd thought were private. I used to sit on the bathroom floor because it was the farthest point from the shared wall, and it turns out that distance didn't matter. She heard everything. She heard it, and she started leaving notes about porch lights and dying tomato plants because it was the only language she had for what she wanted to say. I'm not telling you this to make things strange, she said. I'm saying it because you deserve to know. She turned around then. Her eyes were steady. No pity, no performance, nothing soft in a way that felt practiced, just direct. I didn't come on because Marco canceled and you had an empty seat. I came because I've been on the other side of that wall for 14 months, and you sounded like someone who shouldn't be making this drive alone. I had nothing. No response that was honest without being too much. No joke that could land in a moment like that. I stood on that ridge with the wind coming up the valley and a woman who'd been paying attention to my life in ways I hadn't known about and never asked for, and I couldn't find a single word that fit. We should get back on the road, I said. She nodded, walked back to the truck, put her boots on, and buckled in. She picked up the list and ran her finger down to the next entry like nothing had changed, even though both of us knew it had. There's a diner in Thermopolis, she said. The list says the pie is worth the detour. I stood at the edge of the overlook for another half-minute, looking at the valley I'd nearly blown past at 70 miles an hour. Then I got in the truck, started the engine, and pulled back onto the gravel. The drive down the ridge was quiet in a different way than before. The highway opened up, and the sun started its slow slide toward the western ridgeline. The light shifted from white to gold, and it came through the windshield at an angle that caught the side of June's face while she studied her list. She'd heard me crying through a wall and responded with notes about my tomato plant. She'd spent 5 months building a map of stops for a trip she wasn't invited on. She knew my coffee order, my sunscreen habits, and the sound my jaw makes when something bothers me. 14 months of attention, delivered through drywall and yellow paper, and I hadn't noticed any of it until she was sitting 3 feet away in a truck cab I couldn't leave. The road into Thermopolis dropped us through a canyon I wasn't expecting. The light shifted. The air got cooler. June pulled her jacket tighter and folded the list back into her bag. "The diner's on the main drag," she said, "but we should probably find a place to sleep first. I saw a sign for a motel about a mile back." She looked at me. I looked at her. Both of us in a truck cab that smelled like trail mix and sunscreen and cold coffee. 14 months of wall between us turned inside out in the span of one afternoon. "One problem at a time," she said. I turned the truck around. The motel was called the Copper Bell. Hand-painted sign, 2 stories, a parking lot with room for maybe 6 cars. 3 of those spots were taken. The building looked like it had been built in the 1960s and hadn't changed its mind since. June had seen the sign a mile back. I'd driven right past it. She didn't say a word, just tapped the window with one finger and waited. I parked next to a green pickup with Idaho plates. The engine ticked. The sun was low enough that the light came through the cab at that amber angle and caught the side of June's face while she studied the building like she was reading it. "1 room or 2?" I asked. "2. "Right." We grabbed our bags and walked to the front office. The door had a brass bell above it that jingled when I pushed it open. Behind the counter stood a woman in her early 70s, with white hair in a bun and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She had a paperback face down on the counter and a coffee mug that said, "World's Okayest Wife." "Evening," she said. She looked at both of us, then at our bags, then back up. "We need 2 rooms," I said. She smiled like she was in on something. "I've got one." "1 room. 1 room, 2 beds. There's a youth baseball tournament in Thermopolis this weekend and every place within 30 miles is full. You're lucky I had a cancellation." I looked at June. She was studying a framed photo on the wall behind the counter, black and white. A man in overalls leaning against a fence post with a woman beside him, her hand on his arm. "We'll take it," June said. The woman held out her hand. "Doris Pemberton, I own this place. Built it with husband Franklin in 78. She nodded at the photo. "That's us. Summer of 74, back when he still had hair and I still had patience." I signed the register. Doris turned the book around, read my name, then looked at June. "Matsuda. Different last names." Doris looked between us. "Honey, Franklin and I had different last names for the first 6 years we knew each other, too." "We're not together," I said. "Didn't say you were." She pulled a metal key off a peg behind her. "Room 12. 2nd floor, end of the hall. Balcony faces the mountains. Coffee's in the lobby at 6. She slid the key across the counter. I picked it up. "How long you 2 known each other?" Doris asked. 14 months, June said. "Neighbors," I added, quick, like correcting a line on a shipping form. Doris set her elbows on the counter and leaned forward. "Franklin was my neighbor. Did I mention that? House next door for 6 years. We shared a fence line. He'd mow up to the property boundary and stop, and I'd mow up to it from my side, and once a week we'd stand there on either side of that line talking about weather and soil and whatever else 2 people talk about when they're too stubborn to say the real thing." She took a sip from her mug. 40 years ago this November, he knocked on my door and said he was tired of mowing his half. June's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes softened, a shift you'd miss if you weren't watching closely. I was watching closely. I didn't know when that had started. I looked down at the counter. The wood had decades of scratches in it, names and dates and circles from coffee mugs. I traced one with my thumb while Doris watched me, not looking at June. "Sleep well," Doris said, "and don't fight over who gets the bed by the window." That's always Franklin's side. Room 12 was small, 2 twin beds with handmade quilts, a nightstand between them with a lamp that had a pull chain, a bathroom the size of a closet, and a sliding glass door that opened onto a narrow balcony with 2 metal chairs and a view of the mountains that made the room worth twice whatever Doris was charging. June dropped her duffel on the bed closest to the door. She unzipped it, pulled out a toothbrush and a small toiletry bag, and disappeared into the bathroom. I stood in the middle of the room holding my sleeping bag, like I'd forgotten what rooms were for. The faucet ran, stopped. Ran again, the same rhythm I'd heard through the wall at home for over a year, once around 7, once around 10. Same sound, same pattern, different side of the wall. She came out with her face washed and her hair down. I hadn't seen her with her hair down before. It changed the shape of her face, made her look like a different version of the woman I'd built from sounds and sticky notes and waves across a driveway. "Balcony?" she said. "Sure." We sat in the metal chairs with the mountains going dark in front of us. September in Wyoming means the sun takes all its warmth when it leaves. Stars were starting to show, not the ones you see from a city, the other ones, the ones that make you feel small in a way that doesn't feel bad. June had her knees pulled up, arms wrapped around them. She was looking at the sky. "Can I tell you something?" she said. The last time she'd started a sentence like that, we'd been standing on a ridge, and she told me she'd heard me crying through a wall. I braced. "Okay. The duplex when I moved in, I chose it on purpose." "You chose it because the rent was reasonable." "I chose it because someone was already living on the other side." Something in my chest tightened, like the space between my ribs had shrunk by half. "I'd been apartment hunting for 2 months," she said. "I looked at 12 places. 5 were better locations, 3 were cheaper. The duplex wasn't the best option on paper." "Then why?" She pulled her knees tighter. "The landlord mentioned the other tenant. Said you were quiet. Recently divorced. Kept to yourself." She looked at the mountains instead of me. "I'd been living alone for 3 years, Ethan. I didn't want another apartment where I couldn't hear anyone. I wanted a wall I could hear through." I let the words land where they landed. She'd chosen the proximity. Not me, exactly. She didn't know me then, but she'd picked the duplex the way you pick a seat at a coffee shop near the window instead of in the corner, because you want to be near something even if you don't plan on touching it. 14 months of sticky notes and sounds through drywall and waves from the driveway. None of it was accidental. She'd walked into all of it with her eyes open. I thought about the night I'd signed my lease. The landlord had pointed at the shared wall and said, "Other side is a young woman, quiet type." I'd heard that and felt nothing. Filed it next to free parking and coin laundry. June had heard whatever her landlord told her about me and decided, yes, that wall. That's the one I want. "June, you don't have to say anything." "I know. And you don't have to make it into something. I'm telling you because today seems to be the day for telling you things." I stood up. The chair scraped against the concrete, louder than I expected, cutting through the quiet like a wrong note in an empty room. "I need to take a walk," I said. She didn't ask why. She nodded once and looked back at the mountains. I went downstairs, across the parking lot, past the green pickup with the Idaho plates, and onto the shoulder of the road. No sidewalk, just gravel and grass and the highway running empty in both directions. It was too much, that's the plain truth. A person can absorb a certain amount of being known before it starts to feel like standing under a light you can't turn off. She heard my coffee grinder at 4:52 every morning. She knew my jaw clench. She'd heard me cry through a wall and left notes about my porch light and dying tomato plants. She'd built a list of road stops for a trip nobody invited her on, bought bear spray 3 months in advance, and picked her apartment because I was already in the other half of it. All of it was gentle. That was the problem. Gentle things don't give you an excuse to pull away. They just stand there and wait. Claire said I was never really there. Maybe this was why. Because being there meant someone could see you. And what June had been doing for over a year was seeing me in ways I hadn't agreed to and wasn't ready for. I walked until my breathing slowed, and the tightness loosened enough that I could think straight. The gravel crunched under my boots. A coyote called somewhere in the hills to the west and went quiet. The air smelled like sage and cooling asphalt. My phone buzzed. Marco. I almost let it ring. But Marco was the kind of person who called twice if you didn't answer, and the second call always started with, "Are you dead or just ignoring me?" "Hey. Hey, man." His voice was different from this afternoon. The easy confidence was gone. He sounded like someone who'd been staring at a wall for a while. "What's going on?" "Vanessa broke up with me." I stopped walking. The gravel went quiet under my boots. "What?" Over text. 3 sentences. "I've been thinking this isn't working anymore. I'm sorry." He laughed. "The kind that isn't funny. 3 sentences, Ethan, that's what I got." "When?" 2 hours ago. I was at work. Read it standing next to a forklift. The highway was dark and empty. Just me and Marco's voice coming through the speaker. "I'm sorry, man." 3 hours before that, she texted me a heart emoji. 3 hours. Then she ends it in a text message. What am I supposed to do with the heart emoji, Ethan? Frame it? I didn't have an answer. I stood on the gravel shoulder and listened to him breathe. I canceled the trip for her, he said. I told you I chose her. Remember? I said I chose her and she was happy, and this was the right call. He stopped. I chose her and she didn't even pick up the phone to end it. Marco. She wrote that I wasn't present enough. Her exact words. You're here, but you're not really here. Those words landed inside my skull, like something thrown hard against drywall. You're here, but you're not really here. Claire had said the same thing to me. Different woman, different room, same shape. And Marco was hearing it 400 miles south from a text message, standing alone in the kitchen of an apartment he'd stayed home to protect. You gonna be okay? I asked. Yo, I don't know, he exhaled. I just needed to tell someone who wouldn't try to fix it. I'm not going to fix it. That's why I called. We stayed on the line for another minute. Quiet, the kind of quiet between two people who don't need to perform for each other. Don't get eaten by a bear, he said. I'll try. Night, Ethan. Night. I hung up. The highway stretched into the dark. Somewhere behind me, June was on a balcony looking at mountains. Marco stayed home, gave up the trip, the 5 days, the cold water and the elk, and the kind of silence that makes you forget spreadsheets exist, because Vanessa asked him to, and she left him over text while he was standing next to a forklift. I turned around and walked back toward the motel. The sign glowed orange against the dark, a small warm square in the middle of nothing. My boots were loud on the gravel. I didn't try to be quiet. The lobby was dark. The stairs creaked. I stopped outside room 12 and pressed my hand flat against the door. Cool wood. I could hear her inside, the familiar rhythm of footsteps and settling that I'd been listening to for 14 months from the other side of a different wall. I opened the door quietly. The lamp between the beds was on low. June was in her bed facing the wall. Her shoulders rose and fell under the quilt with the slow, even rhythm of real sleep. My bag was on the other bed where I'd left it. I sat down and unzipped it to find a clean shirt for morning. That's when I found the note. Yellow. Small. The same size as every note she'd ever stuck to my door. Pressed to the inside of my bag, right on top of my extra socks in the same careful handwriting I'd been collecting in my kitchen drawer for over a year. You always forget sunscreen. She'd packed it before dawn, before she showed up on her porch with the duffel bag and the crossed arms and the whisper. She'd opened my travel bag in the dark and tucked a note inside and closed it again. I hadn't noticed because I never check inside my own bag. Why would I? Nobody puts things in your bag when you live alone. Except she didn't live alone. She lived 12 feet away on the other side of my wall, and she'd been putting things into my life for 14 months. Quiet things, small things. Things I was only now learning to count. 8 notes, 7 in the kitchen drawer back home, 1 in my hand in a motel room in Wyoming. I held it up in the dim light from the window. The adhesive had lost most of its grip from pressing against cotton all day. Such a small thing, a square of yellow paper no bigger than my thumb. But she'd put it there in the dark, hours before I knew she was coming, and that was the part I couldn't stop turning over. I put the note in my pocket and turned off the lamp. Lay there in the dark listening to June breathe on the other side of a room smaller than my bathroom at home. Somewhere down the hall, Doris Pemberton was asleep next to a man who'd been her neighbor for 6 years before he knocked on her door and said he was tired of mowing his half. 40 years. That's how long a fence line could turn into a marriage if you let it. Her list sat folded in her bag between our beds. 15 stops, each one in her careful handwriting. But I hadn't read the last one. I wouldn't see it until morning, and when I did, I'd understand this trip had never been about Yellowstone. Slough Creek was everything Marco had promised. 3 nights of cold water and elk tracks, and the kind of quiet that makes you forget delivery routes exist. June set up her tent 20 feet from mine and kept every ground rule she'd laid out in the truck. But the things she hadn't made rules about were the things I noticed. The way she sat by the creek reading, without needing to fill the quiet. The way she handed me the last of her trail mix on the second afternoon, without looking up. The way she said goodnight from inside her tent with the same tone she used through the wall back home. Quiet and certain, like she'd been saying it for years. The morning we packed up, I found the list on the camp table. She was breaking down her tent across the clearing, efficient, methodical, the same way she'd packed her duffel into something the size of a grocery bag. The list sat between our coffee cups, open, face up, like she'd left it for me. I picked it up. 15 entries. Most of them had small checks beside them now. Stops we'd made over 4 days of driving and 3 nights of Wyoming sky. The hot springs and the overlook and the diner in Thermopolis, all checked off. Each one with its mile marker and its note in the margins. June's careful handwriting, compact and deliberate, filling the page from top to bottom. Stop 14, Meadow Creek Trailhead, mile 87 on return, 1 mile loop, wild looping in September. Stop 15, the last entry. Home. And under it, in the same careful handwriting, our street address. Not her half of the duplex or mine. Both sides of the building, the whole thing with the wall running down the middle. I read it twice. The first stop on her list was a set of hot springs 2 hours from our driveway. The last stop was the driveway itself. She'd built a road that went out and came back. Every stop, every mile marker, every note in the margin was part of a circle she'd drawn 5 months ago, and Yellowstone was just the top of the arc. I stood there, holding the list when she walked over with her tent bag. "You read it," she said. "Yeah." She reached past me for her coffee, took a long sip and looked at the clearing, the creek, the trees going gold in the early light. "We should get on the road," she said. We loaded the truck in silence. She climbed in and buckled her seatbelt and set the list on her knee. The sign for the interstate appeared a half-mile from the campground exit. Straight shot home, 8 hours if I pushed it. I drove right past the exit without slowing down. June turned and looked at me from the passenger seat. "Mile 87, I said, Meadow Creek Trailhead, wild lupine in September." Something happened to her face. Not a smile. The thing before a smile. The same look she'd had when I told her to get in the truck 4 mornings ago, except this time her eyes were wet and she turned toward the window before I could see the rest of it. "It's a 1-mile loop," she said. "We'll be back on the road in 40 minutes. I'm not in a hurry." She set the list on the dashboard, with stop 14 and stop 15 both visible through the windshield. The trailhead sat at the end of a dirt road that my truck argued with for the last quarter mile. A wooden sign, sun-bleached and leaning, Meadow Creeklip, 2 miles. The parking area was empty, just us and the truck and a magpie on a fence post watching like it had opinions. The trail dropped through aspens into a meadow that opened up golden wide. Lupine scattered through the grass in purple clusters, like someone had thrown paint across the field. The creek ran along the far edge, shallow and clear, making the kind of sound that sits under everything without asking to be noticed. We walked without talking, single file on the narrow parts. Side by side where the trail widened. Her shoulder close enough that I could feel the warmth from her jacket when the breeze pushed us together. At a bend where the creek pooled between 2 flat rocks, she sat down. I sat on the other rock. Our boots were 6 inches apart. "Claire said something to me," I said, "the night she ended it." June picked up a small stone from the creek bed and turned it between her fingers. She said I was never really there. I'd carried that sentence for almost 2 years. It sat behind everything. Every room I walked into, every morning I woke up alone in a duplex with walls thin enough to hear a stranger's piano alarm. Never really there. I'd believed it because I couldn't prove her wrong. Being present and being there were supposed to be the same thing, and I didn't know how they weren't. June set the stone on the rock beside her knee. "I've been on the other side of your wall for 14 months, she said. She said it the way she read entries off the list. Factual, without any performance behind it. I heard you get up at 4:30 every morning. I heard you laugh at your laptop every Thursday. I heard you talk to Marco about this trip for 3 months. I heard you say you'd buy sunscreen and then not buy it." She paused. "I heard you cry. And I heard you stop. And I heard you start filling the hours because you didn't know what to do with the empty ones." The creek kept running and the lupine held still around us. "I'm not going to tell you Claire was wrong. I didn't know you then." She looked at me. "But I've been listening to you be somewhere for over a year. You were there every morning at 4:30. You were there when the recycling caught fire. You were there when I left a note about your tomato plant, and you watered a plant you didn't even know existed." She picked the stone back up and tossed it into the creek. A small splash that disappeared into the current. "You're there, Ethan. You just needed someone close enough to notice." I sat on that rock with the water running past and the lupine catching September light, and a woman who just said the truest thing anyone had said to me in 2 years. She hadn't tried to argue with Claire or make me feel better. She'd offered evidence, 14 months of it, filed away on the other side of a wall I'd thought was just drywall. She stood up and brushed dirt from her jeans. "Let's finish the loop," she said. We walked the rest of the trail without talking. But the silence had changed. It wasn't heavy and it wasn't comfortable. It was the kind of quiet between two people who've said the thing that needed saying and are letting it land where it lands. In the truck, I checked my phone. A text from Marco sent that morning. Hey, moving to Boulder next month. Met someone at the climbing gym. She lives 4 blocks away. Figured I'd try the short distance thing this time. I showed June the screen. She read it and handed the phone back. Good for Marco. He canceled the trip because Vanessa needed him 400 miles away. She broke up with him over text. Now he's moving 4 blocks from someone new. People figure it out at different speeds, she said. She pulled the list from the dashboard and folded it along its creases. Tucked it into her bag. Some people need to lose the distance before they learn what to do with closeness. I thought about Marco reading 3 sentences from a forklift, and I thought about June, who'd moved into a duplex because she wanted a wall thin enough to hear through. Marco lost his distance and went looking for proximity. June started with proximity and waited for me to turn around. We drove and the highway opened flat ahead of us. Same fields, same guardrails, same light, but in reverse. The radio found folk music and June left it. She fell asleep somewhere past the state line, her head against the window, one hand resting on her bag where the folded list sat inside. I drove and watched the road and thought about the kitchen drawer, at home with 7 yellow sticky notes in it, 8 counting the one still in my jacket pocket from the motel. I thought about what it would feel like to walk through my front door and hear the wall again, knowing what I knew now. Knowing that the sounds I'd been filing under neighbor noise for over a year were someone paying attention, someone choosing to stay close. I pulled into the driveway at 9:15. The duplex looked the way it always had. 2 porches, 2 doors, and the strip of grass between them going brown at the edges from the September dry. June woke up when I cut the engine. Home, she said. Yeah. She grabbed her duffel from behind the seat, unbuckled her seatbelt, and pushed the door open. June. She stopped with one foot on the gravel and looked back at me. Thank you for the list. She looked at me the way someone looks at a person they've been watching through a wall for 14 months. Recognition. The look of someone who'd been paying attention so long that she didn't need to explain why. Good night, Ethan. Good night. She crossed the strip of grass and walked up her porch steps. Her key turned. The door opened and closed. I sat in my truck listening to the engine tick, the same way it had ticked at every gas station and overlook and motel parking lot for the past 4 days. I went inside and dropped my bag by the door, walked to the kitchen and opened the drawer. 7 yellow sticky notes. I took the 8th from my jacket pocket, the one from my travel bag. You always forget sunscreen. Set it on top of the stack and closed the drawer. Then I stood there in my kitchen, alone for the first time in 4 days, listening to the wall. That's how the trip ended, but it's not how the story ends. 3 weeks later, I bought a pad of yellow sticky notes from the drugstore down the street. Stood in the office supply aisle for 10 minutes, comparing shades of yellow to the ones in my memory. There are about 30 options in this world, and I picked the closest match to hers. My first note said, "Your porch light was on all night. Thought you should know." I stuck it to her door at 6 in the morning on my way to work. My hand wasn't steady. A grown man leaving a sticky note on his neighbor's door shouldn't feel like standing at the edge of a cliff, but that's what it felt like. When I got home that evening, the note was gone. A new one sat in its place in her handwriting. I know, I left it on for you. The next morning I left another. Your recycling bin is getting full. Her response, bring it in and I'll make you coffee. I brought the bin in. She made me coffee. We sat on her porch and drank it and didn't say much. Her knee was 4 inches from mine. That night the faucet came through the wall at the usual time, same rhythm, same pattern. But now I knew she tilted her head and closed her eyes when she let the warm water run over her hands. The notes went both directions after that. Hers, you sang in the shower this morning. First time I've heard that. Mine, your alarm melody. I like it. Hers, the tomato plant is back. New one on the stoop. Don't kill this one. Mine, come over for dinner, making something that might be terrible. The doors stayed open. Hers propped with a boot in nice weather. Mine cracked while I ate dinner. Sounds moving freely between 2 halves of a building that had always been one structure pretending to be 2. One Tuesday night in October, I knocked on her door. She opened it with her hair down and socks on the hardwood, holding tea in both hands. Same flannel shirt from the morning she'd shown up on my porch with a duffel bag and a whisper. I held up a yellow sticky note. She looked at the note and then looked at me. What does it say? I turned it around. I already unpacked. She stood in her doorway, holding tea with both hands. Her eyes did the same thing they'd done at the creek, wet and steady at the same time. She read it once and then read it again, slower. "I know," she said. "I heard you moving furniture through the wall." She stepped back and the door opened wider. I walked in. What would you have done if the person on the other side of your wall had been leaving notes for 14 months and you never thought to ask why? Have you ever been that close to someone and missed it? Tell me in the comments, and if you like this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.